In this week's LEGO City update, I'll be adding overhead lines to my train tracks. I started off by measuring the distances between the different masts that then hold up the overhead lines. And with that being done, we can start the design process of the masts themselves. So what I'm doing is I'm stacking 1x1 bricks on top of each other, adding a chain in front simply for decoration. And then on top, I'm adding bars, pins, as well as hinges to hold up the cables. In total, I've now built 10 masts for the first section of the train tracks. I'm adding the overhead lines to as a test. These, by the way, are the cables I'm now using to connect the different masts with each other. As you can see, the whole construction is of course quite fragile, and therefore it's even more important to get the spacing of the different masts correct. I've now started by measuring the distance from the first mast to the train tunnel, because I obviously want the overhead lines to disappear within the tunnel, so it would seem that it goes on inside the tunnel. And with having the first mast placed, it's now time for the most difficult part, connecting all the cables and actually getting the spacing right, because I don't want the masts to be tilted when placed into the landscape. What you'll definitely notice at this point of the video is how extremely loose the cables of the overhead lines are, and that they actually look wave-like, which is of course something I definitely need to get rid of by the end of this update video. What I'm planning to do is adding tension to the whole construction in order to then also have the middle part of the cables actually being pulled up. At this point, I've now reached my first problem. I couldn't simply add a mast directly in front of the train station, so I needed to improvise. What I did is I actually added the bars holding the cables directly to the building, which is something you sometimes even find in real life, so I was quite satisfied with this solution. The only thing I then needed to do is add one more mast at the end of the train station, and then I've actually reached the biggest problem of this update, getting the curvature of the overhead lines fitted to the curvature of the train tracks beneath. Next up, I had to work in an area I could only reach by climbing onto my layout and standing on the street. It's actually quite exhausting working this way, because I somehow have to balance standing on my toes, and trust me, you can't do that for several minutes straight. So I was trying to get that part done as quickly as possible, although I firstly had the problem of not having enough masts in the curve, and then secondly, the next mast I needed to place would have been directly on top of the railroad crossing, which is another reason why later on in this video I'm coming back for a few corrections into this section of the overhead lines. The other curve leading into the train tunnel in the back of my LEGO City was actually much better than the curve in front, because the radius in this case was bigger, and therefore it was obviously easier to fit the cables to the curvature of this section. In a few seconds, I'll also show you how I've managed to have the cables disappear into the train tunnel. Now, as I've just mentioned, I'm adding another mast to the overhead lines in the curve with a tighter radius, and this was a major upgrade. I'm actually also thinking about adding another mast between the end of the train station and the curve. Here you can see the importance of adding tension to the whole construction, because that essentially gets rid of all the waves I'm having in the overhead lines. How I've managed that, and this is my favorite solution of this update, by adding a pin in the ceiling of the train tunnel and then connecting the cables to this pin, which then tightens the overhead lines. Having the basic structure complete, it's now time to finally test the overhead lines by letting the train run. So I've just started the train. It should arrive any second now. There it is. And I mean, this is the third or fourth lap now, and there's one problem. It's this thing right here. The chain is a bit too far on the right hand side. You'll see it any second now as soon as the train arrives. There we are. And now look at this. I mean, that's way too close and way too risky, to be honest. So that's definitely the next thing I'll improve. Alright, so I've slowed down the tempo of the train this time. There we are. I have a few more seconds to show you what I've actually changed in the layout. What I've done is I've moved both of the masts away from the curve by one stud, because both actually were the problem before. I've run a few test laps before with the train and then actually put the camera right here in order to have video evidence of what's going wrong. And now here we are. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, that's much better than before. I've now let the train run for 20 minutes straight. There hasn't been a single problem so far. At the moment, the train, by the way, is somewhere in the other rooms. It should arrive in a few seconds now. My plan now for the overhead lines is to have the other mast. There it is. Look at that. Let me let the train pass a second real quick. So my plan now is to have the other mast directly on the opposite side of the train tracks along this way, and then following the curve towards the train tunnel on this side. I'm not quite sure if I want to add overhead lines on the other train track in the back of the LEGO City, but we'll see about that. With that being said, that's it for this week's LEGO City update. I really hope you enjoyed, and I see you again in the next one.